Pearl Auberlin at 70, after 52 years of smoking herring on the Passamaquoddy Bay and 41 years of raising her only son in a small saltbox house above the harbor, had believed that her boy would never be the man who locked his mother out of the front door of the only home she had ever known. She was wrong. 2 years after the stroke that had slowed her left side and quickened Travis's eye for what she might leave behind, her son had stepped in to manage things. He had moved her into a tidy waterfront one-bedroom in a building he himself had developed. He had taken the keys to the salt box. When Pearl heard from a herring boat captain that the old Auberlin Cannery on the South Wharf was going up for tax auction the following Tuesday, she counted the cash in her sweater pocket. $5, a folded 5 3/4. She drove down anyway. Travis was supposed to be there. Travis had been planning for that auction for 14 months. Travis was sitting in I-95 traffic outside Bangor when the gavel came down at $5 to the only bidder in the room, his mother in her pea coat and sea boots with a folded 5 3/4 in her hand. What Travis had never understood about his great-grandfather Otto was that the old canner had built a vault behind the brine room that none of his 3 sons had ever been told about, and Pearl now owned everything inside it. If you have ever been managed by a son who waited until you were tired, if you have ever been told to be grateful for a one-bedroom that was paid for with your own quiet labor, if you have ever stood at a tax auction counter with 5 crumpled dollars and a stubbornness no one expected to last, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Pearl Auberlin found behind the brine room of that $5 cannery will make you believe that a great-grandfather kept a door open for 50 years that no developer's son was ever meant to walk through. Welcome to the last chapter. The morning of the stroke, Pearl had been pulling a tray of split ale wives from the smokehouse rack behind her salt box when her left hand stopped knowing what her right hand was doing. The tray hit the gravel. She sat down on the back step. The smoke kept rolling out the open door behind her, sweet and cold, and the gulls kept arguing on the pilings, and Pearl Auberlin, who had hauled herring nets in February since she was 18 years old, looked at her own left hand on her knee and understood, in the slow, careful way she understood weather, that something inside her had let go. The neighbors found her there 20 minutes later. By the time the ambulance reached Calais, the left side of her face had begun to remember itself, and by the time she came home from the hospital 9 days later, she could grip a coffee cup with both hands again, slowly, and walk the pier without holding the rail. What she could not do in the months that followed was keep her son from arriving at her front door with a folder under his arm and a careful expression on his face. Travis Auberlin, 49 years old, owner of Auberlin Marine Logistics out of Portland, had decided that his mother required management. He used the word often and gently, and always with the small wince of a man who believed he was carrying a weight no one else could see. He moved her papers. He moved her accounts. He moved her, eventually, out of the salt box above the harbor and into a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a building he himself had developed 3 blocks inland, where the windows faced a parking lot and the kitchen smelled of new caulk. He told her she would be safer there. He told her the salt box was too much house for one woman with a slow left side. He told her the harbor wind was hard on a body that had given the bay everything it had. He took the keys. Pearl did not fight him. Pearl had buried Brendan 9 years before, quietly, the way Brendan would have wanted, and she had learned in those 9 years that grief had no use for argument. She let her son carry the boxes. She let him list the salt box at a price she suspected was low. She let him deposit the proceeds into an account she could not access without his co-signature. She let him explain every Sunday at the diner what he was doing for her, and she nodded, and she ate her eggs, and she watched his blue eyes flicker toward the harbor every time a boat came in, the way a man's eyes flicker toward a woman he is preparing to leave. What Pearl did not know in those 2 slow years was that Travis had been quietly buying up the South Wharf 1 parcel at a time. 12 of the 14 waterfront lots on the lower harbor had passed, by then, into the hands of Auberlin Marine Logistics or one of its 3 shell LLCs. The 13th was the old Auberlin Cannery itself, the long, low wooden building with weathered gray shingles and the leaning brick smokestack, condemned since 1979, owned on paper by a probate trust that had stopped paying property taxes a decade earlier. The 14th was a stretch of tide flats Travis already had under contract. He needed the cannery to bridge the project. Without the cannery, his luxury condo development, 4 buildings of glass apartments stacked along the Passamaquoddy Bay, would not have a road to its own front door. He had been planning for the tax auction for 14 months. He had told his investors, a Boston firm called Holcomb Thatcher, that he could secure the cannery parcel for $50. He had told his wife Brielle that he expected to be home for dinner. He had told no one, least of all his mother, that the old cannery was the linchpin of a $4 million deal. He had not expected anyone else in Eastport to bid. Eastport, he had explained to his investors over a glass of bourbon in a Portland boardroom, was a town that had run out of ambition. Levon Sear, who had captained a herring seiner out of Eastport for 31 years and whose father had bought sardine cans off Otto Auberlin's loading dock in 1948, found Pearl on a Saturday afternoon at the small grocery on Water Street and told her what he had heard. He had heard it from a clerk at the county tax office, who had heard it from a paralegal in Travis's Portland firm, who had a sister in Lubeck. He had heard that the Auberlin Cannery, the building Pearl's grandfather had built with his own 2 hands in 1908, was going up at $5 on Tuesday morning, and that Travis Auberlin was the only bidder anyone expected to walk through the door. Pearl set down her can of evaporated milk on the grocery counter and looked at Levon for a long moment. She thanked him quietly. She paid for the milk. She drove home to the 1-bedroom apartment with the parking lot view, and she sat down at the kitchen table with the folded 5 3/4 from her sweater pocket, and she counted them 3 times, slowly, the way her grandfather had taught her to count smoked herring on a packing tray. Tuesday morning came in low and gray, with a salt fog rolling off the bay, and Pearl Auberlin walked into the Washington County tax auction room in her heavy navy peacoat and her cream Aran sweater and her sturdy brown leather sea boots, and she set the folded 5 3/4 on the wooden counter in front of the clerk and said she was bidding on the cannery. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s named Doris, looked up from her clipboard and asked Pearl if she was sure. Pearl said she was. Doris asked her again. Pearl said she was. The auctioneer, a thin man in a brown corduroy jacket, called the lot once, twice, 3 times. The room held 7 people, 4 of them clerks. The gavel came down at $5 to Pearl Auberlin of Eastport, and Doris stamped the receipt and slid it across the counter, and Pearl folded it carefully into the inside pocket of her pea coat and walked back out into the fog. Travis arrived 10 minutes later. His black Range Rover skidded into the gravel lot with the back end fishtailing, and he came through the auction room door, red-faced and breathing hard, and Doris told him, with a small, careful smile, that the cannery had already sold. Travis asked who had bought it. Doris told him. Travis stood very still for the length of 3 breaths. Then he turned and walked back out into the fog without saying a word. Pearl was standing beside her old Subaru in the gravel lot, the receipt folded into her inside pocket, the fog rolling in off the bay behind her, when her son came across the gravel with his hands clenched at his sides, and his blue eyes lit up the way she had not seen them lit since he was a small boy who had broken something he could not fix. He did not lower his voice. He stood 3 feet from her in front of half the wharf, in front of the auction clerks, in front of 2 lobstermen who had come out of the diner across the street to see what the noise was, and he called his mother selfish. He called her stupid. He told her she had cost him $4 million. He told her she did not understand what she had done. He told her she was a tired old woman who had no business at an auction counter without him present. He told her he would unwind it. He told her he would have his lawyer in Portland on the phone by noon. He told her she had made the worst mistake of her life. Pearl let him finish. She had let Brendan finish. In their 41 years of marriage, every time Brendan had needed to finish, and she knew the shape of a man emptying himself in front of a woman who had not moved. When Travis finally stopped, she looked at him with her sharp green eyes and said quietly that the cannery was hers now and that she was going to walk it that afternoon. She said she would be at the diner on Thursday at noon if he wanted to talk. She did not raise her voice. She did not move her hands. She watched him climb back into the Range Rover and slam the door, and she watched the Range Rover skid out of the gravel lot and turn south toward Portland. And then she stood in the fog for a long time and listened to the gulls. She drove after that, not to the cannery, but to the saltbox above the harbor. She parked across the street and did not get out. The new owner had already painted the front door a glossy navy and put a brass knocker on it that did not belong there. The flower boxes Brendan had built her in the 2nd year of their marriage had been pulled off and replaced with black wrought iron planters full of plastic ferns. The smokehouse out back, she could see through the side yard, had been knocked down. Pearl Auberlin, who had not wept in front of anyone since the morning Brendan died, sat in her old Subaru with her hands on the wheel and let the tears come slowly, one at a time, the way a tide comes in over a flat. She did not sob. She did not make a sound. She watched the salt box for 19 minutes. Then she turned the key in the ignition and drove down the hill to the South Wharf. The cannery sat where it had always sat, long and low and gray-shingled, the sagging tin roof rusted dark, the brick smokestack leaning a 1/4 degree out of true, the way it had leaned for at least the last 40 years. The heavy oak door, with its iron hinges and its massive brass padlock, faced the gravel pad. The wooden pier extended out into the harbor in a long, crooked line, half its planks gone, the rest grayed by 60 winters of salt. Stacked rusted sardine crates leaned against the side wall. The tide was running out, and the flats below the pier glistened slick and brown in the gray light, and a single gull stood on the slumped end of the pier and watched her without moving. Pearl carried her brown leather suitcase out of the trunk of the Subaru and walked it down to the pier and set it on a square of plank that still looked sound, and she sat down beside it with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the tide go out. Her grandfather, Otto Auberlin, had laid the first cornerstone of this cannery in the spring of 1908 when he was 24 years old, and he had run it for 50 years before he had died of natural causes in the autumn of 1962 at the age of 78, quietly in his own bed, with the cannery still smoking herring under the supervision of his oldest son. Pearl's father, Felix, had worked these packing tables as a young man. Pearl herself, at 6, had stood on an overturned crate in this brine room and watched her grandfather slide a tray of split herring into the cold smoke. At 11, she had run her first net off the south wharf with her father in a borrowed dory. At 16, she had taken her own herring license. At 29, she had married Brendan Auberlin in the Methodist Church on Washington Street and moved into the saltbox above the harbor. At 40, she had stood on this pier with a 4-year-old Travis on her hip and pointed out the seal that had hauled out on the rocks below. At 45, she had watched Travis, 12 years old and skinny, shucking sardines on a wooden table inside this cannery for $1 an hour and complaining that his hands smelled of fish for a week afterward. At 55, she had attended the funeral of the last canner her grandfather had trained, an old man named Wilfred Doucette, and stood beside his grave and listened to a Methodist minister talk about the closing of an industry. At 61, she had buried Brendan. At 68, she had had the stroke. At 70, on a fog-thick afternoon in late April, she sat on the half-collapsed pier of the cannery her grandfather had built and watched the tide go out and listened to the gull. And she understood, in the slow, careful way she understood weather, that something inside her had begun to come back. She pulled her phone out of her peacoat pocket and called Rosalie Beaumont. "Rosie," she said, "I bought the cannery." Rosalie was quiet for a beat. Then Rosalie said, in the voice of a woman who had been the postmistress of Eastport for 36 years and had not been surprised by anything since 1987, "I will bring the bolt cutters." The next morning at low tide, before the fog had burned off the bay, Rosalie's 1994 Ford F-150 pulled up onto the gravel pad in front of the cannery with a clatter of loose tools in the bed. Rosalie climbed down with a pair of long-handled bolt cutters and a thermos of black coffee and a paper bag of cinnamon donuts from the bakery on Water Street, and she handed Pearl a donut and looked at the brass padlock on the heavy oak door and grinned the way she had grinned at age 10 when she had dared Pearl to jump off the high pier in October. "2 cuts," Rosalie said. "Maybe 3. It was 2. The old brass gave with a soft, heavy snap, and the padlock fell into Rosalie's gloved hand, and Pearl pushed open the heavy oak door with her shoulder and stepped into the cannery for the first time in 44 years. The smell hit her first. Cold smoke, salt, old cedar, the faint sweet rot of brine that had soaked into wood for half a century. The light came in through the boarded windows in long, pale bars. The packing tables ran the length of the building in 2 long rows, their tops scarred with knife marks and dark with old herring oil. Rusted brine pans stood overturned on stacked oak barrels along the south wall. The brick smokestack rose at the back of the building through a ragged hole in the tin roof, and a thin shaft of gray daylight came down through it onto the floor like a column. Pearl walked the length of the building slowly, with Rosalie 3 steps behind her. She ran her hand along the edge of the first packing table. She tapped the side of a brine pan. She knelt beside the smokehouse door at the back and pressed her palm flat against the cold brick of the smokestack and felt, faintly, the same ghost of warmth a chimney remembers for years after the fire has gone out. The brine room was at the rear of the building, a smaller chamber walled in vertical pine boards black with old salt. The brine vats had been pulled out long ago, but the iron drains were still set into the concrete floor, and the iron hooks were still set into the ceiling joists. Pearl stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly in a full circle, and on the third revolution, she saw it. The back wall of the brine room was boarded floor to ceiling in vertical pine, and the boards had been weathered into the same uniform black as the rest of the room, except that one panel, low and to the right of center, did not match. The grain ran the wrong direction. The nail heads were sunk a 1/16 of an inch deeper than the heads on the boards on either side. The seam at the top of the panel was a hair too clean. Pearl said, "Rosie, come look at this." Rosalie came. They eased the panel loose with the claw end of Rosalie's hammer, slowly, the way you ease a barnacle off a hull. The panel came free with a soft, dry squeak, and Pearl set it down against the side wall, and the two of them stood and looked at what had been hidden behind it for 50 years. A heavy iron-banded vault door set into a frame of dressed granite, with a small slot beneath an iron knob. The door was the color of old wet pewter. The iron bands were peened with square hand-set rivets. A small brass tag had been wired to the iron knob with a length of copper wire that had gone green at the twists. And on the tag, in handwriting Pearl had not seen since she was 19 years old, were 6 words that made the back of her throat close. For the Auberlin who keeps Eastport alive. Pearl reached out and touched the tag with the tip of one finger. Rosalie did not say anything. The fog had begun to burn off the bay outside, and the long pale bars of light through the boarded windows had brightened a quarter shade, and somewhere out on the water a herring boat blew its horn twice, low, the way a herring boat blows when it is coming home empty. Pearl said, "Rosie, that is my grandmother's hand." Rosalie said, "I know it is." They stood there for a long time before either one of them moved. Pearl Auberlin had spent 52 years on the water, and a fisherwoman who has spent 52 years on the water reads a building the way she reads a hull. She walked the cannery that afternoon with a steel measuring tape, a flashlight, a small spiral notebook, and the property survey she had printed at the Peavy Memorial Library the morning before the auction. She started at the northeast corner of the foundation and worked clockwise. She tested every wall stud at shoulder height with the back of her knuckles, listening for the dull thud of dry wood and the soft, pulpy thud of moisture damage. She found 3 studs along the south wall that needed replacing, 2 along the east wall that did not, and a section of the back wall around the brine room panel that was, surprisingly, dry to the bone. She measured the foundation. The cannery's outer walls ran 96 feet on the long axis and 32 feet on the short, with a smokehouse addition at the rear that added another 14 feet. She recorded the dimensions in her notebook in the neat, blocky printing her father had taught her at 12. She checked the figures against the property survey. The survey listed the building footprint at 96 by 32 with a 14-foot rear addition, and Pearl nodded and underlined the agreement in her notebook with a single short stroke. She climbed up onto the loading platform at the side and tested the platform planks one by one with her boot heel. 4 of them gave. She marked them with chalk. She climbed back down and walked the half-collapsed pier as far out as the planking would allow her, testing each plank the same way, marking the unsound ones with chalk. She counted 23 sound planks and 41 unsound. She wrote the count in her notebook. She estimated, with the practiced eye of a woman who had repaired her own dock at least 11 times, that the pier could be rebuilt for somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000 in lumber and labor, depending on whether the pilings below the tide line were still sound. She photographed every artifact. She used the small digital camera Rosalie had brought down from the F-150, an old Canon with a cracked rubber grip, and she took a careful photograph of every brine pan, every overturned barrel, every stacked sardine crate, every packing table, every rust mark on the tin roof, every name penciled onto a door frame. She photographed the boarded windows from the inside. She photographed the brick smokestack from below, looking up through the hole in the roof. She photographed the iron-banded vault door, 3 angles, with and without flash. She photographed the brass tag with her grandmother's handwriting on it, twice, close. Rosalie hauled out the rusted brine pans, one at a time, with a pair of leather work gloves and a stubbornness that did not wait for permission. The pans came out of the brine room and stacked themselves in the gravel pad in a long, crooked row, and by mid-afternoon there were 19 of them, dark with rust, their riveted seams still tight after 80 years. It was Rosalie who found the logbook. She had cleared off the central packing table with a wide push broom, and under a layer of old burlap and dust, she found a small leather-bound book the size of a hymnal. The leather cracked, but the spine still tight, and she carried it across the room to Pearl and set it down on the brine room sill. Pearl opened it carefully. The paper was rag stock, heavy, and the ink was iron gall. The first page was dated March of 1908, and the entry was 4 lines long, written in a careful hand Pearl had only ever seen on the back of one yellowed family photograph. First brine, 28 pounds salt to 50 gallons seawater. Herring run from the bay running heavy. May the Lord keep us in clean fish. Otto Auberlin. The book ran 50 years. Brine ratios, herring runs, shipping ledgers. The names of every man and woman Otto had hired, the wages he had paid them, the days he had given them off when their children were sick. Pearl turned the pages slowly, the way she would turn the pages of a Bible, and Rosalie sat on the edge of the packing table and watched her, and the gulls argued on the pilings outside, and the tide turned. Heath Tremblay arrived the next morning at 10. He came up the gravel pad in an old green Toyota truck, 64 years old, retired 3 years from the Maine Department of Marine Resources, with a thick gray mustache and a canvas field bag over one shoulder. Rosalie's nephew, who fished out of Lubeck, had told him over coffee at the diner what Pearl Auberlin had done at the auction Tuesday, and Heath, who had known Pearl's father Felix professionally in the late 70s and had once shaken Otto Auberlin's grandson, Travis's hand at a Marine Resources hearing in Augusta and disliked him on the spot, had decided to drive over and offer his help. He introduced himself to Pearl on the gravel pad with the quiet deference of a man who had spent 40 years working with old fishermen. He told her he had known her father. He told her he had read her father's herring run records into the state database in 1981. He told her he had heard about the cannery and wondered if she might let him take a walk around the foundation. Pearl said yes. Pearl liked the look of him. She had buried Brendan 9 years ago, and she had not had a man on her property since, and she had forgotten until Heath Tremblay set his canvas field bag down on the packing table and pulled out a folded hydrology map. how much she had liked the company of men who took the bay seriously. Heath unfolded the map on the central packing table. It was a 1908 hydrology survey, photocopied from the state archives, marked with the spidery ink of a draftsman who had walked the South Wharf with a rod and chain 118 years ago. Heath traced a thin blue line with the tip of his pencil. The line ran beneath the cannery foundation and out under the half-collapsed pier toward the tide flats. "Pearl," he said, "you have an artesian spring under this building." Pearl looked up from the map. She said, "A what?" Heath said, "A freshwater inflow, naturally pressurized. Comes up out of the bedrock and runs out through the foundation and into the bay. It was marked on the 1908 survey when your grandfather built. I doubt he ever capped it." "I would bet you a donut it is still running," Rosalie said. "There is no donut left, Heath." Heath grinned. He went down on his knees on the cold concrete floor of the brine room with a small pry bar and a flashlight. And inside of 15 minutes, he had pried up a square iron grate Pearl had not even noticed in the back corner of the brine room. And beneath the grate, set into a stone-lined cistern below the foundation, was a slow, steady inflow of cold, clear water rising out of the bedrock and running down a copper trough to a drain that emptied somewhere out under the pier into the bay. Pearl knelt beside the grate and put her hand into the water. It was cold, the way well water is cold. It tasted, when she touched her wet finger to her tongue, of stone and of nothing else. Heath said, "I am going to call a friend in Eastport. There is an archivist at the main Maritime Museum who needs to see this building. Her name is Yara Coury. If I tell her you have a 1908 cannery with an unfiled artesian spring and a hidden vault door, she will be in Eastport tomorrow morning before the fog burns off," Pearl said. "Call her." Yara Coury arrived the next morning at 7:15 in a small gray Subaru hatchback with a Maine Maritime Museum decal on the rear window and a 33-year-old archivist behind the wheel who introduced herself with a firm handshake and a notebook already open. She wore round wire frame glasses and a navy fisherman's sweater of her own and a pair of mud-stained bean boots, and within 4 minutes of walking into the cannery, she had pulled a pair of cotton gloves out of her bag and was photographing Otto's logbook page by page on a small tripod-mounted camera. She worked in silence for an hour. Then she stood up from the packing table and said, "Mrs. Auberlin, this is the most complete 50-year canning record I have ever personally handled. Whatever else is in this building, the logbook alone is a museum-grade artifact." Pearl said, "There is more." She took them then to the brine room and showed them the iron-banded vault door behind the panel. Yara stood very still in front of the door for a long moment, and then reached out with one gloved finger and traced the green twisted copper wire of the brass tag with the tip of her glove. Yara said, "Mrs. Auberlin, is there a key?" Pearl said, "I think there is." She had remembered, sometime in the small hours of the morning, lying awake on the narrow bed in the one-bedroom apartment with the parking lot view, that her grandmother, Eulalie Auberlin, had once shown her. When Pearl was 9, a small iron key, taped inside the front cover of a leather-bound book on the top shelf of the parlor bookcase. The book had passed, after Eulalie's funeral in 1979, into Pearl's father's hands, and after her father's funeral in 1996, into Pearl's. It had sat for 30 years on the top shelf of the bookcase in the saltbox above the harbor. When Travis had moved her into the one-bedroom apartment, he had moved the bookcase. Pearl had unpacked the books herself. She had pulled Otto's logbook off the packing table and turned it over in her hands and felt, through the back cover, the unmistakable hard square of a small object taped to the inside of the leather. She had not opened it yet. She had wanted Heath and Yara in the room. She opened the back cover now. The tape, brittle with age, came away, With a small, papery sound, the small iron key fell into her palm, no longer than her thumb, dull gray, with a square bit and a single notch. It was at that moment that the rumble of a heavy V8 engine came up the gravel pad outside, and Rosalie, who had been standing in the brine room doorway, looked out through the cracked side window and said very quietly, "Pearl, your son is here." Rosalie moved first. She crossed the cannery in 7 long strides and shot the heavy iron deadbolt on the inside of the oak front door, and she set the steel security bar Heath had carried in from the truck across the door braces, and she stepped back and crossed her arms and looked at Pearl with the same grin she had worn at age 10 on the high pier in October. The pounding started 30 seconds later. Travis hit the door with the flat of his hand 4 times in quick succession, and then with his fist, and then with the flat of his hand again. He shouted Pearl's name. He shouted that he knew she was inside. He shouted that the cannery was a hazardous materials site under the state environmental code, and that she had no legal right to enter the structure. He shouted that he was calling his lawyer in Portland. He shouted that he was calling the Eastport police. He shouted that he had a court order coming. He shouted that she was a stupid old woman who did not understand what she was doing. Pearl stood in the brine room with the small iron key in her palm. She did not move. She listened to her son call her stupid through 3 inches of oak and 118 years of weathered pine. Heath, very quietly, unfolded a small wooden folding chair he had brought in from the truck and set it down beside her. Pearl sat. Yara stood beside the iron-banded vault door with her camera on its tripod, the lens cap off, her gloved hands folded in front of her, waiting. Travis kept shouting. He shouted for 11 minutes. Pearl knew it was 11 minutes because Heath was watching the second hand on his old steel field watch. And at minute 8, Heath looked up at her and said, "He is going to lose his voice before he loses his anger." At minute 11, Travis stopped shouting and stood breathing hard on the gravel outside the door, and they all heard the heavy slam of the Range Rover's driver door and the chunk of the gear lever and the long fading rumble of the V8 receding down the wharf road toward Route 1. Rosalie said, "He will be back." Heath said, "He will be back with a lawyer." Yara said, "Then we should hurry." Pearl looked down at the small iron key in her palm. It was warmer than she had expected. The brass tag wired to the iron knob of the vault door read still in her grandmother's hand, "For the Auberlin who keeps Eastport alive." Pearl Auberlin, who had hauled herring nets in February since she was 18 years old, who had buried her husband 9 years ago, and her father 30 before that, and her mother 12 before that, who had had a stroke at 68 and learned how to grip a coffee cup with 2 hands again, who had walked into a tax auction room with a folded 5 3/4 in her sweater pocket because a herring boat captain had told her something on a Saturday afternoon at the small grocery on Water Street, stepped forward and slid the small iron key into the slot beneath the iron knob of the vault door. The key turned. The iron-banded vault door swung open on its hidden hinges, with a long, low sigh of dry old wood, and a breath of cold, dry, cedar-scented air rolled out of the opening into the brine room, and the 4 of them stood in the doorway of a chamber that no human being had walked into since the autumn of 1958. The room was lined floor to ceiling in red cedar planking, every plank tongue and grooved, every nailhead countersunk, the cedar still pale and dry and faintly sweet, in the way only cedar that has been sealed away from weather can be. 3 walls of shelving ran the length of the chamber. The shelves held leather-bound ledgers, dozens of them, stacked spine outward, each spine labeled in Otto Oberlin's careful hand, with a year and a quarter, master canning records, brine ratios, herring runs, shipping ledgers, 50 years of an industry, set down on rag paper and iron gall ink, sealed behind a vault door in a brine room behind a panel that did not match. In the center of the room, on a small cedar pedestal, stood a folded American flag, 46 stars, sewn in 1908, the year Otto laid the cornerstone, the year the cannery opened for its first run. Beside the flag, on the same pedestal, sat a heavy cast-iron mortar, the kind a canner used to grind salt for brine, the iron worn smooth on the rim by 50 years of Otto's right hand. Yara made a small sound in the back of her throat. She didn't say anything. She lifted her camera off its tripod and began, slowly, methodically, to photograph every shelf. Pearl walked the length of the chamber. She ran her hand along the edge of the topmost shelf. She lifted the topmost ledger from its place, and as she lifted it, a small object taped to the back cover of the ledger came away in her hand. A second small iron key, slightly larger than the first, the iron darker. A small paper tag tied to the bow with a length of waxed thread, and on the tag, in Otto's hand this time, not Eulalie's, the single capital letter S. Pearl held the key up. Heath said, "S for safe." Yara said, "There is a floor safe in here. They found it inside of 2 minutes." One of the cedar planks in the floor at the back of the chamber, near the rear wall, was hinged. The hinges were countersunk and oiled and silent. Heath lifted the plank with the tip of his pry bar, and beneath the plank, set into the concrete subfloor, was a small square iron safe with a single keyhole and no combination dial, the iron painted black, the keyhole rimmed in brass. Pearl knelt. She slid the second iron key into the keyhole. The key turned with a soft, heavy click. The lid of the safe lifted on its own hinges slowly, and the four of them looked down into a small dry chamber lined in oilcloth. Inside the floor, safe lay 3 things: a folded document in heavy parchment, sealed in oilcloth and tied with red wax twine; a second folded document in lighter parchment, sealed in a separate oilcloth wrap, its corners creased with the careful folds of a state surveyor; and a long sealed envelope of cream paper, addressed in Otto Auberlin's hand, in iron gall ink, with the same 6 words that had been wired to the vault doorknob: "For the Auberlin who keeps Eastport alive." Pearl lifted the first document. She unfolded the oilcloth on the cedar pedestal beside the flag. The parchment was the original 1908 deed to the Auberlin Cannery property, signed by Otto Auberlin, signed by the seller, witnessed by 2 men whose names Pearl recognized from the headstones at the Methodist Cemetery, and embossed with the raised seal of the Washington County Registry of Deeds. Yara read the metes and bounds aloud, slowly, her gloved finger tracing the lines on the parchment. The deed described a parcel of 4 acres, beginning at an iron pin set in the gravel of the South Wharf Road, running thence south along the line of mean high water for 410 feet, thence east into the bay along a line perpendicular to the road for a distance of 430 feet, thence north along the line of the bay for 410 feet, thence west to the point of beginning. Heath said, "Pearl, that is 4 acres of waterfront. The county records show this parcel as a half acre." Yara said, "A 1972 surveyor's error reduced the deeded parcel by 3.5 acres on paper. I have seen this exact category of error in 3 other coastal Maine parcels. The original 1908 deed governs. It was never legally amended. The 3.5 acres of waterfront that Travis Auberlin's condo development needs in order to bridge his project belong on the original recorded deed to this cannery." Pearl lifted the second document. She unfolded the oilcloth. The parchment was a 1953 Maine State Hydrological Survey of the South Wharf, sealed and signed by a state hydrologist named Aldous Pemberton, documenting the artesian spring beneath the cannery foundation as a continuous freshwater inflow of measured volume and tested potability. The survey had been filed with the state but never recorded with the county. Yara read it twice. Then she said, "Mrs. Auberlin, under modern Maine water law, an unfiled but documented freshwater spring of this volume and potability qualifies for protected public source status. That qualification cannot be developed over. It can only be preserved. And a preserved 1908 working sardine cannery on the eastern Maine coast with a documented artesian spring is eligible for the Maine Maritime Heritage Restoration Endowment, which is currently funded at $1.8 million. Heath whistled low. Pearl lifted the third object from the floor safe, the long sealed envelope of cream paper. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. She unfolded the single page inside. She read it once to herself, slowly, in the cold, dry light of the cedar chamber. Then she lifted her head and read it aloud, in a voice that did not shake, to Rosalie and Heath and Yara. "I built this cannery in 1908, and I have watched every Auberlin born under this roof. The grandson who reads this letter has either kept the herring running or sold the harbor for a row of glass apartments. If it is the second one, I am sorry. The vault is for the one who would not sell. Walk out of here with your suitcase, my child, and remind the bay who its people are. Otto Auberlin, 1958. Rosalie wept. She did not make a sound. She stood beside the cedar pedestal, with her arms folded across her chest, and the tears ran down her face, the way the tide runs out over a flat. Heath whistled, low again, and rubbed a hand across his thick gray mustache, and looked at the floor. Yara said, very quietly, "Mrs. Auberlin, by tomorrow afternoon, you will own the most important sardine cannery on the eastern Maine coast and the freshwater rights to half the South Wharf. Your son's condo project is dead on paper as of the moment I file the authenticity affidavit. I need you to come with me to Eastport in the morning." Pearl folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She slid it back into the cream envelope. She tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of her pea coat, beside the auction receipt for $5. She said, "Yara, we are going to Eastport in the morning." She looked at Rosalie. Rosalie wiped her face with the back of her wrist and grinned the grin from the high pier in October, and Pearl said, "Rosie, make a list of every retired Eastport canner still living. We are going to need them." Rosalie said, "There are 11 of them. I have their numbers." Heath said, "I am calling a friend at the Maine DEP tonight. He owes me for a 1989 striped bass survey he never thanked me for. He will walk an artesian spring filing through the department in 4 days." Yara said, "I will draft the authenticity affidavit on the 1908 deed before I leave Eastport tonight. I will file it with the Washington County Registry of Deeds at 9 in the morning." Pearl nodded. She looked around the cedar-lined chamber one more time. The 50 years of ledgers on their shelves, the folded 46-star flag, the cast-iron mortar worn smooth on the rim by Otto's right hand, the small floor safe still open, its oilcloth lining catching the lantern light. She said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Grandfather, I am sorry it took me 70 years. She closed the iron-banded vault door behind her with both hands. She slid the small iron key into the inside pocket of her pea coat beside the cream envelope and the auction receipt. She walked the length of the cannery with her brown leather suitcase swinging easily at her side, and she stepped out into the late afternoon light on the gravel pad, and the fog had burned off the bay entirely by then, and the herring boats were running into the harbor on the rising tide. The next 4 business days moved with the careful efficiency of a tide. Yara filed the authenticity affidavit on the 1908 deed at the Washington County Registry of Deeds at 9:11 on Wednesday morning. The clerk, a woman named Constance Pelletier, who had known Pearl since the 2nd grade, pulled the original 1972 survey out of the archive, compared the metes and bounds, found the surveyor's error in 2 minutes, and stamped the affidavit with a small, grim smile. Heath's friend at the Maine DEP, a hydrologist named Marcus Teal, walked the artesian spring filing through the department in 3 days flat, attaching the 1953 Pemberton survey as supporting documentation and recommending immediate protected source status. The Maine Maritime Museum Board, briefed by Yara on Friday morning, voted unanimously to support a Maine Maritime Heritage Endowment application for the cannery. By Monday afternoon, the 4-acre cannery parcel and the artesian spring beneath its foundation were formally recorded under the name Pearl Auberlin of Eastport, Maine, and the parcel's protected source designation was filed with the state. Travis's Auberlin Marine Logistics lost the Eastport waterfront permits on Tuesday morning. The city's planning office, which had been preparing to issue final approval on the 4-building luxury condo development, received a formal notice from the Maine DEP that 3.5 acres of the project's footprint sat on a deeded parcel not owned by Auberlin Marine Logistics, and that an additional 0.8 acres sat above a protected source artesian spring. The planning office withdrew the permits within 48 hours. The Eastport city manager, a quiet man named Philip Doiron, who had grown up 4 houses down from Pearl in the Saltbox neighborhood, called Pearl personally on Wednesday evening to congratulate her. Holcomb Thatcher, the Boston firm that had committed $4.1 million in investor funding to Travis's project, demanded a full refund within 60 days. Travis did not have $4.1 million in liquid assets. He had spent the last 18 months leveraging his Portland real estate portfolio to acquire the Eastport waterfront parcels, and the Eastport waterfront parcels were now, without the Cannery Bridge, worth roughly 30 cents on the dollar. He had committed a representation in writing to Holcomb Thatcher that he held clear development rights on the Cannery parcel. He had not held clear development rights on the Cannery parcel. Holcomb Thatcher's general counsel, a sharp woman named Imogen Veach, filed a breach of representation suit in Suffolk County Superior Court on the 2nd Friday of May. The complaint ran 91 pages. 2 of Travis's commercial real estate contracts in Portland collapsed within the same week. A waterfront retail conversion on Commercial Street, in which he had been the principal partner, terminated his participation under a morals and representation clause. A mixed-use development in South Portland's East End, in which he held a minority stake, bought him out at a 30% discount on his contributed capital. By the end of May, Auberlin Marine Logistics had lost roughly $6 million in committed and projected revenue. Brielle filed for legal separation on the first Monday of June. The papers were served at his Portland office by a process server in a gray suit, and Travis signed the receipt without looking up from his desk. The separation petition cited financial misrepresentation as the sole grounds. Brielle moved to her sister's house in Falmouth the same afternoon. She did not return Travis's phone calls. Travis put the lake house on Sebago Lake up for sale on the 2nd Wednesday of June at a price his realtor described in a private email to a colleague that was later leaked to the Portland Press-Herald as desperate. The lake house sold within 9 days at 12% below asking. The proceeds went directly to the Holcomb Thatcher escrow account. The Eastport waterfront men who had nodded at Travis at Wadsworth's Diner for the last 3 years began that summer to stop Pearl on the wharf to compliment her on the small front-page article the Quoddy Tides ran on the third Friday of May. The article was 4 columns long, with a photograph of Pearl standing on the gravel pad in front of the cannery in her pea coat and her cream Aran sweater, and a sub-headline that read, in the deadpan style of small-town Maine journalism, local woman buys family cannery for $5, discovers it owns half the wharf. The reporter, a young man named Calvin Truitt, who had grown up in Pembroke and gone to journalism school at the University of Maine, had interviewed Pearl for 40 minutes on a bench at the head of the South Wharf. He had quoted her exactly twice. Once when she said, "My grandfather built this place. He kept it for somebody." Once when she said, "I am that somebody." Travis tried to call Pearl on the 3rd Sunday of June. He left a voicemail. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long, and Pearl listened to it once on the porch of the saltbox above the harbor, and then she deleted it. He did not try again. Pearl visited her grandfather Otto's grave at the Methodist Cemetery on the first Saturday of July at sunrise. She carried with her a small clay vial of brine drawn from the artesian spring beneath the cannery floor, sealed with a cork her father had whittled in 1962. She poured the brine slowly onto the headstone, in a thin, steady line, the way her grandfather had poured brine over a tray of split herring when she was 6 years old. The sun came up over the bay behind her, pink along the eastern rim, gray-blue overhead. She stood for a long time with her hands folded in front of her. Then she said quietly to the headstone, "Grandfather, the herring are still running." She walked back to the Subaru in the cemetery parking lot with her brown leather suitcase swinging easily at her side. Pearl Auberlin accepted the $1.8 million Maine Maritime Heritage Endowment on behalf of the Otto Auberlin Eastport Heritage Cannery on the 2nd Tuesday of August in a small ceremony on the gravel pad outside the cannery, attended by the Governor's Deputy Chief of Staff, the Director of the Maine Maritime Museum, 11 retired Eastport canners, 2 members of the Passamaquoddy Tribal Council, Rosalie Beaumont in a clean blue work shirt, Heath Tremblay in his canvas field jacket, Yara Coury in her round wireframe glasses, and a young reporter named Calvin Truitt, who had brought a notebook and a small folding chair. Pearl spoke for 2 minutes. She thanked her grandfather. She thanked Rosalie. She thanked the bay. She did not mention her son. Restoration began the following week. A crew of 7, led by a master shipwright from Lubeck named Edmund Chass, who had been one of Otto's last apprentices, replaced the rotted studs in the south wall, the sagging tin roof, the unsound planks of the half-collapsed pier, and the leaning brick smokestack. The smokestack came down in 3 sections over 4 days, was repointed in the original lime mortar, and was rebuilt straight and true into the eastern Maine sky over the course of 9 weeks. The artesian spring was opened, with the careful counsel of Heath Tremblay, as a free public freshwater source, tapped through a brass standpipe set into a granite plinth at the head of the wharf. The plinth was inscribed with the words, in small Roman capitals, Otto Auberlin, 1908, free to the people of Eastport forever. The cannery reopened in the spring of the following year as the Otto Auberlin Eastport Heritage Cannery, a working small-batch sardine canning facility, and a public museum of Maine's canning heritage. The first run of small-batch smoked herring went into cans in the 2nd week of April. The cans were labeled with a simple paper wrap designed by Yara Coury that bore Otto's signature in the iron gall ink of his 1908 logbook. The first case sold at the Eastport Farmers Market for $42 within 9 minutes of going on display. Travis's creditors, in the slow course of his unwinding, forced the sale of the saltbox above the harbor. The buyer who had purchased it from him 2 years before had carried a note that came due, and Travis, unable to service it, was forced to broker a sale back to its original owner at fair market value to avoid a default cascade that would have triggered an additional Holcomb-Thatcher claim. Pearl bought the saltbox back on the first Friday of October for $168,000, paid in full from the proceeds of a small batch canning contract Yara had negotiated with a New York specialty grocer. Pearl moved back into the saltbox on the second Saturday of October. She unpacked the bookcase herself. She set Otto's logbook, returned to her after the museum had completed its archival photography, on the top shelf where her grandmother's leather-bound book had once stood. The smokehouse Brendan had built her in the second year of their marriage, knocked down by the buyer 2 years before, was rebuilt by Edmund Chass and his crew in 3 weeks at no cost to Pearl. They used the original cedar from a stack that had been sitting under a tarp behind the cannery since 1957. Pearl smoked her first tray of split herring in the new smokehouse on the third Sunday of October. She ate one of them, slowly, sitting on the back step with a cup of black coffee, and she watched the gulls argue on the pilings, and she thought, for the first time since the morning of the stroke, that her left hand was beginning again to know what her right hand was doing. Pearl founded the Otto Auberlin Eastern Maine Fisheries Apprenticeship in the second year of the cannery's operation. The apprenticeship was a paid 2-year program training young people of Washington County in commercial fishing, herring smoking, and small batch canning, funded jointly by the Maine Maritime Heritage Endowment and a small annual appropriation from the cannery's canning revenues. 5 apprentices started in the first cohort. One was a young woman from Pembroke named Hadley Gagnon, whose father had captained a herring seiner out of Eastport for 23 years. One was a young man from Calais named Tobias Doiron, whose grandfather had been one of the 11 retired canners on the gravel pad at the August ceremony. One was a young Passamaquoddy woman named Winona Lola, whose grandmother, Pauline Lola, had worked the Auberlin Cannery in the 1950s as a packer and had been mentioned in Otto's logbook by her first name on 3 separate days in the summer of 1953. Rosalie Beaumont ran the Welcome Center at the head of the wharf. She wore a clean blue work shirt and a name tag that read Rosie in block capitals, and she greeted every visitor by asking where they were from and whether they had ever smoked herring. Heath Tremblay consulted on the Artesian Springs hydrology, walking the public freshwater source twice a year with a small calibrated meter and filing the readings with the Maine DEP. Yara Khoury curated the museum archive, rotating the displays 4 times a year, and brought up a small group of graduate students from the University of Maine each summer to catalog Otto's 50 years of ledgers. Pearl, on Sunday mornings, walked the pier at low tide with her brown leather suitcase by her side. She carried in the suitcase, on most Sundays, a thermos of black coffee, 2 cinnamon donuts from the bakery on Water Street, and a small spiral notebook in which she recorded the herring runs the way her grandfather had recorded them in iron gall ink in the spring of 1908. The cannery's smokestack, restored, rose straight again into the eastern Maine sky behind her. The artesian spring ran cold and clear into its granite plinth at the head of the wharf. The bay fog rolled in at dawn and burned off by mid-morning. The herring boats ran. The gulls argued on the pilings. Pearl Auberlin, at 72, walked the wharf her great-grandfather had built, and watched the tide come in and understood, in the slow, careful way she understood weather, that something inside her had not let go after all. Thank you for walking the South Wharf with Pearl through every step of her journey. From the cold arithmetic of a son who waited for her to be tired to the tide-light dawn over a cannery her great-grandfather had been keeping for her since 1908. If Pearl's story touched something deep inside you, if you have ever been managed by a child who learned to call your decisions confusion, if you have ever stood at a tax auction counter with 5 crumpled dollars in your palm, if you have discovered that the people who came before you had been keeping a door open for decades, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realized that the harbor of your childhood remembered who you were, even when your own son did not. Because Pearl's story proves that a great-grandfather builds a vault only the right granddaughter is ever meant to open, that a working harbor remembers its people long after the developers have flown back south, and that 5 crumpled dollars and a stubbornness no one expected can outweigh 4 million in venture capital when the right woman holds them. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like a worthless cannery on a forgotten Maine wharf can hold a freshwater spring no developer ever read, because Otto Auberlin kept the truth of Eastport behind the brine room for 50 patient years. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.